Steve Harvey stopped the show after a racist player refused to shake his hand, a moment that would forever change how television handles discrimination. In an instant, decades of smile and move-on entertainment culture collided with raw human dignity. What unfolded next stunned not just the audience, but network executives who scrambled to control the situation. No one expected Steve's response would trigger a chain reaction that would reverberate through the entire entertainment industry. It was supposed to be just another taping of Family Feud, the kind of episode that had become routine for Steve Harvey after hosting thousands of them. The studio lights were bright, casting their familiar warm glow across the soundstage. The audience was energized, their applause echoing through the rafters as they settled into their seats. A new family walked onto that stage, ready to compete for cash and glory, their faces flushed with excitement and anticipation. Everything felt normal, comfortable, predictable, the exact formula that had made Family Feud an American institution for generations. But this family was different in ways that would soon become impossible to ignore. From the moment they took their positions at the podiums, there was something profoundly off about one of the contestants, a man in his 30s, with a cold, calculating stare that didn't match the usual nervous excitement of game show participants. His jaw was clenched, his shoulders were rigid, he barely smiled. When the cameras panned across his face, he didn't wave to the camera, with the enthusiastic energy typical of contestants. While his family members seemed genuinely thrilled to be there, practically bouncing with anticipation, he looked like he had something to prove, something darker than a simple desire to win prize money. The first few rounds played out smoothly, following the familiar rhythm that millions of viewers had come to love. Steve cracked his usual jokes, the audience laughed right on cue, and points were tallied on the big board. The banter flowed naturally, the way it always did when Steve was in his element. But as the game progressed deeper into the episode, the tension became impossible to ignore for anyone paying close attention. This contestant kept making snide comments under his breath whenever Steve spoke. He rolled his eyes dramatically at Steve's humor, the same kind of humor that typically had audiences roaring with laughter. He deliberately avoided eye contact during friendly banter that was specifically designed to bring families closer together and create memorable television moments. His body language screamed hostility. His facial expressions radiated contempt. Steve, ever the consummate professional with decades of experience under his belt, tried to smooth things over with his signature charm and wit. He'd been doing this for longer than most people had been alive. He knew how to read a room and diffuse awkwardness before it spiraled out of control. He adjusted his approach, tried different angles of humor, attempted to find common ground. But no matter what he did, no matter how hard he tried, this man's hostility only seemed to grow with each passing moment. The other family members were winning points, building their lead, clearly enjoying themselves despite their relative's sour demeanor. The antagonist was losing control of the game, falling further and further behind. His competitive spirit was turning into something uglier, something that had nothing to do with the game itself. Steve could feel it, that sixth sense that comes from years of live television and human interaction. Something was building beneath the surface, something darker than a simple game show disappointment. This wasn't just a sore loser. This was calculated. This was intentional. This was personal in a way Steve couldn't yet articulate. The studio felt smaller. The air felt thicker. Even the audience seemed to sense the shift in energy, their laughter becoming less frequent, more uncertain. But what Steve didn't know was that this contestant had come with a plan that would change everything. The tension had been building for several minutes, but the actual breaking point came during the final Fast Money, round the most anticipated segment of every Family Feud episode. This was where individual contestants faced off against the clock, racing to answer rapid-fire questions while the studio held its breath in eager anticipation. It was supposed to be fun, exhilarating, a chance for someone to walk away with serious cash and the glory of victory. The winners often left the stage beaming with pride, having shared in not only the thrill of competition but also the camaraderie that blossomed among family members during the show. But for this particular contestant, It quickly became something else entirely. Steve stood at his podium, cards in hand, ready to fire off the questions that would determine the winner of this round. He looked at the man across from him, trying to gauge his mood, and offered his trademark smile, the one that had disarmed countless nervous contestants over the years. "All right, let's see what you've got," Steve said warmly, his voice carrying that perfect blend of encouragement and showmanship that made him a master of his craft and a beloved figure in the world of television. The man didn't smile back. Instead, his eyes were hard, focused, and filled with a simmering intensity that sent an unsettling chill through the studio. He seemed to be preparing for battle rather than a game show. The questions began, each one designed to elicit quick, light-hearted responses. Name something you might find in a gym. The contestant answered quickly, almost aggressively, as if he were attacking the question rather than responding to it. "Weights," he exclaimed, his voice sharp and clipped. "Next question. Name a reason someone might avoid going to the beach." Again his answer came rapid fire, but this time, his tone was laced with sarcasm. "Too many people," he stated flatly, without a hint of the humor that usually colored such responses. Steve continued, maintaining his rhythm, trying to keep the energy positive despite the palpable hostility radiating from across the podium. He asked questions like, "Name something a person might take on a picnic." The man shot back with sandwiches, but his demeanor was increasingly combative, as if he were daring Steve to challenge him. Then came a question that seemed innocent enough: name something that might be considered rude to do at a dinner table. The contestant's face suddenly contorted, his expression morphing from indifference to outright anger. His hands balled into fists, and it became clear that he was no longer playing the game. He was preparing to unleash a torrent of pent-up frustration. Instead of answering the question, he stood up from his stool abruptly and pointed directly at Steve, his finger jabbing through the air like a spear. "You know what's rude?" he shouted, his voice cutting through the studio like a knife. "You standing there like you were so much better than everyone else, like you were so enlightened and progressive. I'm not shaking your hand. I'm not playing along with your fake civility. I see right through you." The studio went silent, completely, utterly silent. Steve's expression didn't change immediately. Years of training kicked in. He was a professional. He was used to handling unexpected moments on live television. But his eyes widened slightly, the only visible sign that something unprecedented was happening on his stage. The audience, caught off guard, didn't know whether to gasp, cheer, or sit frozen in shock. Camera operators looked at each other uncertainly, their hands hesitating over the controls as they scrambled to adjust to the sudden shift in the atmosphere. Producers in the control room likely had their hands hovering over buttons, unsure what to do. This wasn't scripted. This wasn't part of the show. This was real conflict, raw and unfiltered, happening live in front of hundreds of people and millions of viewers at home. It was a moment that transcended entertainment, touching on deeper social issues that had been simmering beneath the surface for years. Steve took a breath, his mind racing as he weighed his options. He set his cards down slowly, deliberately. He could feel the weight of the moment pressing down on him, the gravity of the situation becoming more pronounced with each passing second. All eyes were on him now, waiting to see how he would respond. In that moment, he had to make a choice that would define not just this episode, but his entire legacy as a host and a public figure. The tension in the air was thick enough to cut with a knife. The audience was holding its collective breath, caught between shock and curiosity. Some were beginning to whisper among themselves, unsure of what would happen next. Would Steve stand his ground? Would he allow this moment to escalate? Or would he diffuse the situation with his trademark humor and grace? What happened next would shock everyone in that studio and change the course of television history forever. The silence stretched on for what felt like an eternity, though in reality, it was only a few seconds. Steve Harvey stood motionless at his podium, his mind racing as he processed what had just happened. In those brief moments, he made a decision that would become the defining moment of his career, not because of anger or defensiveness, but because of something far more powerful: empathy, understanding, and a willingness to break the fourth wall of entertainment to acknowledge the humanity of another person. Steve set down his cards completely and took a deliberate step forward. His face was calm, composed, but his eyes reflected something deeper, a recognition that this wasn't tea about him or the game show anymore. This was about a human being who was struggling with something profound, something that had nothing to do with Family Feud or television ratings or the pursuit of prize money. This was about the fundamental human need to be seen, to be heard, to be acknowledged as worthy of attention and respect. "Hold on," Steve said, his voice steady and measured, carrying the weight of someone who had lived through his own struggles and come out the other side. He didn't raise his voice. He didn't become defensive or dismissive. Instead, he spoke with the quiet authority of someone who had lived long enough to understand that people's outbursts rarely had anything to do with the present moment. They were usually echoes of accumulated pain, frustration, and disappointment that had been building for years, waiting for the right moment to explode. "Before we go any further, I want to ask you something. Not as a host, not as Steve Harvey, the television personality, not as someone who has achieved a certain level of success and comfort, just as a man talking to another man. One human being reaching out to another." The contestant was visibly taken aback. He had prepared for confrontation, for Steve to either shut him down harshly or engage in argument, defending his position and his reputation. He hadn't prepared for this, for genuine curiosity, for authentic interest in understanding what was really driving his anger. The man had steeled himself for rejection, not for invitation. "What's really going on here?" Steve continued, stepping around his podium and moving closer to the contestant. The physical movement was significant. It broke down the barrier between performer and audience, between host and guest. "Because I've been doing this for a long time, and I can tell when someone's angry about more than just a game show. I can see it in your eyes, in the way your shoulders are tensed, in the way you holding your breath. So what is it? What brought you here today? What's the real story?" The man's jaw clenched visibly. His eyes glistened slightly with unshed tears, and for a moment, the anger seemed to crack like thin ice over deep water, revealing something underneath: pain, frustration, a deep sense of injustice that had been festering for years, accumulating like scar tissue over old wounds. The audience remained absolutely still, their collective consciousness shifting as they sensed that they were witnessing something real, something raw, something that transcended the typical format of daytime television entertainment. "You don't know what it's like," the man said, his voice wavering slightly, the bravado cracking to reveal the vulnerability beneath. "You sit up here, you make your jokes, you talk about unity and family values, you present this image of someone who understands, the common person, but you don't know what it's like to feel invisible, to feel like the system is rigged against you, to watch people like you get celebrated while people like me are forgotten, to work hard, to do everything right, and still feel like you're not enough." Steve nodded slowly, his expression reflecting genuine understanding rather than pity. He didn't interrupt. He didn't defend himself or his position. He simply listened, and in that listening, he created a space where this man could finally be heard, truly heard, perhaps for the first time in a very long time. "I came here thinking maybe if I won, if I got the money, something would change," Marcus continued, the words tumbling out now that the dam had broken. "I thought maybe winning on national television, having my moment, getting recognized for something maybe that would prove that I matter. Maybe that would validate all the years of struggle. But standing here, looking at you, I realized it wouldn't matter. Nothing changes. We're still invisible. The money would help, sure, but it wouldn't fix the fundamental problem. It wouldn't make the system see us. It wouldn't make society value us the way it values people like you." The words hung in the air like a confession, heavy with the weight of years of accumulated pain and disappointment. Several members of the audience had tears in their eyes. The camera operators had stopped moving, frozen in the moment, their professional instincts overridden by the raw humanity unfolding before them. Even the producers in the control room seemed to have paused, recognizing that they were witnessing something that transcended entertainment, something that touched on the deepest issues facing society. Steve took another step forward, closing the physical distance between them even further. His movement was slow, deliberate, non-threatening, the body language of someone offering comfort rather than confrontation. "You know what?" he said quietly, his voice carrying the weight of personal experience. "You were right. I don't know what it's like to be you. I can pretend to understand your specific struggles, your particular circumstances, the unique challenges you face. But I do know what it's like to feel invisible. I do know what it's like to be told you don't belong, that you are not good enough, that you should just accept your place at the margins of society. I do know what it's like to fight against a system that wasn't built for you, that wasn't designed with your success in mind." He paused, allowing his words to settle, his eyes reflecting genuine emotion that couldn't be manufactured or performed. "And I know that standing on this stage, winning money, getting applause, none of that fills that void. That void doesn't get filled by external validation or material success. That void gets filled when we see each other, when we really see each other, when we acknowledge each other's humanity." The contestant's face began to crumble. The anger that had fueled him moments before was dissolving like morning mist, replaced by something more vulnerable, the raw pain of a person who had been carrying a burden alone for far too long, who had internalized the message that his struggles didn't matter, that his pain was insignificant in the grand scheme of things. "What's your name?" Steve asked gently, as if he hadn't read it on his cards, as if he wanted to know it in a more personal, intimate way. "Marcus," the man replied, his voice barely above a whisper, as if speaking his own name aloud in this moment was an act of vulnerability. "Marcus," Steve repeated, saying the name with deliberate care and respect, as if the act of naming him was an act of acknowledgement, of recognition, of saying you exist, you matter, I see you. "Marcus, I'm going to do something I've never done on this show before. Something that breaks every rule in the book. Something that the producers are probably going to have a fit about." He turned to the producers, to the cameras, to the entire studio, making eye contact with as many people as he could. "I'm going to give you the money. Not because you won the game, not because you answered the questions correctly or because you earned it through the normal mechanics of the show, but because I see you. And I want you to know that your struggle, your pain, your frustration, it matters. You matter. Your voice matters. Your story matters." The studio erupted. The audience stood up, applauding not because of a game show victory, not because of the normal excitement of watching someone win a prize, but because they had witnessed something profound, something human, something real in a world that often felt too scripted, too polished, too disconnected from the actual experiences of ordinary people struggling to survive and find meaning in their lives. Marcus broke down completely, his shoulders shaking as tears streamed down his face. Steve pulled him into an embrace, and for a moment, the boundaries between host and contestant, between public persona and private person, dissolved completely. The embrace lasted longer than typical television would allow, and nobody moved to end it. The moment had transcended the format. But this moment of connection would have consequences that neither Steve nor Marcus could have anticipated, consequences that would ripple through the entertainment industry, through social media, through the national consciousness, and would ultimately force a reckoning with what it means to be human in an increasingly dehumanized world. The moment the episode aired 3 weeks later, the internet exploded with unprecedented intensity. Social media platforms became battlegrounds of competing narratives, each side convinced of their interpretation of what had transpired on that stage. Some viewers hailed Steve as a hero, a man willing to break the rules of his own show, to sacrifice the sanctity of the format, to acknowledge human suffering in a way that transcended entertainment. Hashtags like #SeeMe and #SteveSawMarcus trended for days, with thousands of people sharing their own stories of invisibility, of feeling forgotten by a system that seemed designed to overlook them, to render them invisible, to make them feel as though their struggles didn't matter. The comment sections filled with testimonies. People shared stories of job loss, of medical bankruptcy, of watching their communities decay as industries moved overseas. They talked about the erosion of dignity that came with economic insecurity, the way that being poor in America meant being blamed for your poverty, being told that your circumstances were the result of personal failure rather than structural inequality. Steve's moment with Marcus gave voice to a frustration that had been building for years, a sense that the social contract had been broken, that hard work no longer guaranteed a living wage or a dignified life. But not everyone celebrated the moment. Not everyone saw it as beautiful or transformative. Critics emerged quickly, armed with arguments that Steve had overstepped his bounds in ways both obvious and subtle. They claimed he had violated the integrity of the game show format, turning a competition into a therapy session. They argued that he had used Marcus's pain for ratings and publicity, that his gesture was performative activism, designed to rehabilitate his image and boost viewership. Some pointed out, with mathematical precision, that one act of kindness on television didn't address the systemic issues Marcus had raised. They noted that giving one man money didn't change the policies that had created his poverty in the first place, that it was a band-aid on a bullet wound, a symbolic gesture that obscured the need for real structural change. Others questioned whether Steve's own success story was being used to suggest that anyone could overcome adversity if they just worked hard enough, believed in themselves, and maintained their faith. This narrative, they argued, conveniently ignored the structural barriers that made success so much harder for some than for others, the way that race, class, gender, and geography created vastly different playing fields for different people. It suggested that Marcus's struggles were primarily the result of his individual choices rather than the result of systems designed to advantage some and disadvantage others. Conservative commentators seized on the moment as evidence of something they had long argued, that American culture had become too focused on victimhood, that people were using their circumstances as excuses for failure, that the real problem was a lack of personal responsibility. They argued that Steve's gesture, while well-intentioned, actually reinforced a culture of dependency, teaching people that they should expect handouts rather than working to improve their own situations. Progressive commentators, meanwhile, worried that the moment had been co-opted, that it had become a way for mainstream media to acknowledge inequality without actually addressing it, to create the appearance of caring without demanding the structural changes that justice required. They questioned whether Steve, a wealthy entertainer, had the right to position himself as a savior, whether his gesture was ultimately about making himself feel good rather than about creating meaningful change. The network executives were deeply divided. Some saw the episode as a ratings goldmine, a moment of genuine television that had captured the hearts of millions, that had transcended the typical format of game show entertainment to touch on something deeper and more meaningful. They recognized that in an age of streaming and fragmented media, moments of genuine human connection were increasingly rare and valuable. They wanted to capitalize on this, to build on it, to create more moments like it. Others worried about the precedent it set, about what would happen if every contestant expected special treatment, if the show became a platform for social grievance rather than family entertainment. They feared that the show's format would be compromised, that the careful balance between competition and entertainment would be disrupted. They worried about the liability of Steve making unilateral decisions about prize money, about the financial implications of such gestures becoming commonplace. Behind closed doors, there were heated debates about whether the episode should even have aired, whether the producers should have intervened to prevent the moment from happening, whether they had a responsibility to maintain the show's format, even when something more important seemed to be at stake. Marcus, meanwhile, found himself thrust into an unexpected and disorienting spotlight. News outlets wanted interviews. Talk show hosts invited him to share his story, to relive the moment, to provide commentary on the national conversation that had erupted around him. He became, in the eyes of the media, the face of a particular kind of American struggle, the hard-working person left behind by economic systems that no longer valued their labor. The invisible man suddenly made visible. The voice of those who felt forgotten by the institutions and systems that were supposed to serve them. But the visibility came with a cost that Marcus had not anticipated. His social media accounts were flooded with messages within hours of the episode airing. Some were supportive, offering encouragement and sharing similar experiences, expressing gratitude that someone had finally articulated the frustration they felt. But many were hostile, filled with vitriol and contempt. Trolls accused him of being ungrateful, of using Steve for money, of playing the victim, of being a lazy person looking for excuses. They suggested that if he really wanted to improve his life, he should stop complaining and start working harder. Conservative commentators used his moment of vulnerability as a springboard to argue that entitlement culture was destroying America, that people needed to stop blaming the system and take responsibility for their own lives. They presented Marcus as an example of someone who had adopted a victim mentality, who saw himself as a passive recipient of injustice, rather than an active agent in his own destiny. They suggested that his real problem wasn't systemic inequality, but rather a lack of motivation and drive. Others on the left criticized him for accepting money from Steve instead of demanding systemic change, for settling for individual charity rather than fighting for collective justice. They argued that by accepting the money, he had been co-opted, that he had allowed his legitimate grievance to be neutralized by a gesture that ultimately reinforced the status quo. They suggested that real change would require confrontation with power, not cooperation with it. Marcus found himself in an impossible position, caught between competing expectations and interpretations. He had spoken his truth on national television, had allowed his vulnerability to be broadcast to millions, and that truth had been commodified, politicized, and weaponized by people on all sides of the cultural divide. His pain had become a talking point, his struggle a symbol to be deployed in various arguments about the state of the nation, about the future of America, about the proper role of government and individual responsibility. Steve, too, was experiencing unexpected and unsettling consequences. While many praised his compassion and his willingness to break the rules of his show, others questioned his motives more deeply, more critically. Investigative journalists began digging into his past with renewed intensity, looking for inconsistencies between his public image as a moral authority and his private actions. They found instances where he had made controversial statements about relationships, about faith, about social issues. Some of these statements, taken out of context or examined through a modern lens, seemed to contradict the progressive values he had displayed in his moment with Marcus. Clips resurfaced of Steve making jokes that many found offensive, of him expressing views about gender roles that seemed antiquated, of him taking positions on various social issues that didn't align with the compassionate image he had projected. The narrative began to shift, sometimes subtly, sometimes dramatically. What had initially been celebrated as a beautiful moment of human connection became, in some circles, evidence of hypocrisy, of a man whose public persona didn't match his private beliefs. Steve was accused of being a performative activist, of using his platform to appear compassionate and progressive, while his actual beliefs and statements suggested something more complicated, more contradictory. Critics suggested that his gesture toward Marcus was a way of rehabilitating his image, of positioning himself on the right side of history without actually examining his own complicity in systems of inequality. The discourse became increasingly complex and increasingly bitter. What had been a moment of genuine human connection was now being analyzed, dissected, and weaponized in service of various political and cultural arguments. Both Steve and Marcus found themselves trapped in narratives that neither had fully authored, their moment being interpreted and reinterpreted in ways that neither could fully control. Back at the Family Feud studio, the production team faced a profound dilemma. How would they move forward? Would they acknowledge what had happened and incorporate it into the show's format? Or would they try to return to the normal mechanics of the game, pretending that the moment had been an anomaly? Would they attempt to recreate the magic of that moment? Or would they recognize that it couldn't be recreated, that authenticity couldn't be manufactured? The producers decided to invite Marcus back for a follow-up episode, a chance for him to talk about what had happened in the weeks since his appearance, to provide closure to the narrative that had captured so much attention. The network promoted it heavily, sensing another ratings opportunity, another chance to capitalize on genuine human emotion. But behind the scenes there was anxiety and uncertainty. What would Marcus say? Would he express gratitude for how his life had changed? Would he criticize the system further, using his platform to continue the conversation he had started? Would he reveal that his experience had been less transformative than the initial moment had suggested, that the money and the attention hadn't actually solved his problems? The day of the taping arrived, and the atmosphere in the studio was noticeably different from the initial episode. There was anticipation, but also a kind of wariness, an awareness that this moment would be scrutinized, just as intensely as the first one had been. Marcus sat in the green room, waiting to go on stage, his mind churning with thoughts and emotions. He had been living a strange and disorienting existence in the intervening weeks, neither fully returned to his normal life, nor fully integrated into his new reality as a minor television celebrity. The money Steve had given him was in the bank, secure and real, but it hadn't solved his problems in the way he had hoped it might. It had actually created new ones, complications he hadn't anticipated. His family had become targets of both sympathy and resentment. People he hadn't heard from in years suddenly wanted to reconnect, suddenly wanted to be his friend, suddenly wanted to ask him for money or favors. Others accused him of being selfish, of not sharing his windfall with them, of forgetting where he came from now that he had some money. His relationship with his mother had become strained as he tried to navigate her expectations and her own complicated feelings about his sudden visibility. He had used some of the money to help his mother pay off medical bills that had been crushing her for years, bills that had come from a cancer diagnosis she had received 5 years earlier. Some had gone to his daughter's college fund, money that would help her pursue an education and hopefully avoid some of the struggles he had faced. But the rest sat there in his account, a constant reminder of the moment on stage, of the vulnerability he had exposed to millions of strangers, of the way that moment had changed the trajectory of his life in ways both positive and negative. When he walked out onto the stage this time, the audience applauded warmly, but there was something different in the energy. The applause was more measured, more aware of its own performance. Steve greeted him like an old friend, and in many ways, they had become connected by that singular moment, bound together by the intensity of what they had shared. But there was also an awkwardness now, a self-consciousness that hadn't existed before. They were no longer just two people having a genuine human moment. They were two public figures aware that they were being watched, analyzed, interpreted, their every word and gesture being recorded and dissected. "Marcus," Steve began, his voice warm but also careful. "A lot has happened since you were last here. How are you doing? And I want you to be honest. I don't want the version you think people want to hear. I want the real version." Marcus took a deep breath, gathering his thoughts. He had prepared for this question in some ways, had thought about how to answer it honestly, while also being aware of the cameras, the audience, the millions of people who would eventually watch this exchange. But no amount of preparation could fully capture the complexity of what he was feeling. "I'm doing okay," he said slowly, choosing his words with care. "It's been complicated. That moment we had, it meant something real to me. It still does. In that moment I felt seen, I felt heard, I felt like my pain mattered, like my voice mattered. That was transformative in a way I can fully explain." He paused, gathering his thoughts before continuing. "But I've also learned that one moment, no matter how genuine, doesn't change everything. The money helped. It helped my family. I was able to pay off my mother's medical bills, and that took a weight off both of us. I was able to contribute to my daughter's education fund, which gives me some peace of mind about her future. But I am still facing the same struggles I was facing before. I still can't find a job that pays enough to live on with dignity. I still worry about healthcare, about what would happen if someone in my family got sick. I still feel invisible in a lot of ways, even though I am now visible to millions of people." Steve nodded, and there was something in his expression that suggested he understood the paradox of what Marcus was describing, the way that being visible to millions could coexist with feeling invisible in the systems that actually determined your life chances. I think what people don't understand, Marcus continued, gaining confidence as he spoke, his words flowing more naturally now, is that compassion is important, it's valuable, but it's not enough. Steve's gesture was real, and I'm grateful for it, genuinely grateful. But it highlighted something that needs to change at a much bigger level. We can solve systemic problems with individual acts of kindness, no matter how generous those acts are. Steve's gesture was like putting a Band-Aid on a bullet wound. It helps, but it doesn't address the underlying injury. He looked directly at Steve as he spoke, his gaze steady and honest. We need policy changes. We need economic systems that value all people, not just the ones at the top. We need wage policies that allow people to live with dignity. We need healthcare systems that don't bankrupt families. We need education systems that don't perpetuate inequality. We need to address the ways that race, class, and geography create vastly different opportunities for different people. One person giving another person money, no matter how much that money is, doesn't change any of that. The audience was silent, absorbing his words carefully. This wasn't the narrative of gratitude and redemption that many had expected, the story of a man whose life had been transformed by a generous gesture. This was a call for something deeper, something more challenging, something that required more than individual acts of kindness. Steve leaned back slightly, considering Marcus's words with visible care and respect. "You were right," he said finally, his voice carrying the weight of genuine acknowledgement. "And I think that is important for people to hear. My gesture was real, but it was also limited. It was what I could do in that moment, but you were pointing to something that requires more than what one person can do on a game show. You were pointing to the need for systemic change, for policy changes, for a fundamental reimagining of how we structure our economy and our society." He paused, and when he spoke again, his voice carried a note of vulnerability. "I think maybe I need to do more than give away money on my show. I think maybe I need to use my platform differently, to advocate for the kinds of changes you were talking about, to use whatever influence I have to push for policy changes, rather than just offering individual charity." And in that moment, both men understood that their story was far from over, that the real work was just beginning, that the questions they had raised would continue to haunt the national conversation long after the cameras stopped rolling, and that the true test of their commitment would be whether they could translate the emotion of that initial moment into sustained action and systemic change. In the weeks following the second episode's airing, something unexpected happened. Steve Harvey didn't return to business as usual. Instead, he began a quiet but deliberate transformation of his approach to public life and his use of his platform. He met with policy experts, economists, and social justice advocates. He read extensively about systemic inequality, about the ways that economic policies perpetuated poverty, about the historical roots of the disparities that Marcus had articulated so powerfully. His team was concerned. His agents worried that he was straying too far from his brand, that becoming overtly political could alienate portions of his audience. The network executives were nervous about the implications of having their most valuable asset become a vocal advocate for systemic change. But Steve pressed forward, driven by something that felt more important than ratings or brand consistency, a genuine desire to understand the world that Marcus had described, and to use whatever power and platform he had to address it. He began by reaching out to Marcus directly, outside of the television format, outside of the cameras. They had coffee together, just the two of them, in a nondescript cafe far from the Hollywood spotlight. In that conversation, Marcus shared more details about his life, about the specific ways that systemic inequality had shaped his trajectory. He talked about growing up in a neighborhood where the schools were underfunded, where the teachers were often the least experienced and least invested, where college seemed like a fantasy reserved for people from different circumstances. He talked about getting a decent job in manufacturing in his 20s, about the security he had felt, about the belief that if he worked hard, he would be able to provide for his family. And then he talked about the plant closing, about the way that globalization and corporate decisions made in boardrooms thousands of miles away had eliminated his job and the jobs of thousands of others like him. He talked about the retraining programs that didn't work, that taught him skills for jobs that didn't exist, or that paid far less than the job he had lost. He talked about his daughter, about how he had wanted to send her to college but couldn't afford it, about how she had taken out student loans and was now burdened with debt before she even started her career. He talked about the healthcare system, about how a single medical emergency could wipe out years of savings, about how he had delayed going to the doctor for symptoms that turned out to be serious because he couldn't afford the copays. Steve listened, truly listened, not as a television host preparing material for a show, but as a human being trying to understand another person's reality. And as he listened, something shifted in him. The abstract concept of systemic inequality became concrete, became personal, became impossible to ignore. He began to use his platform differently. On his talk show, he started having conversations with economists and policy experts about wage stagnation, about the decline of unions, about the ways that corporate profits had soared while worker wages had stagnated. He interviewed people whose lives had been disrupted by plant closures, by automation, by the hollowing out of the American middle class. He didn't do this in a preachy or self-righteous way. Instead, he simply created space for these conversations to happen, for these stories to be told. The response was mixed. Some viewers appreciated the shift, felt seen and heard by a major media figure who was taking their struggles seriously. Others felt that Steve was overstepping, that he was becoming too political, that he should stick to entertainment rather than trying to be a social commentator. Some accused him of performative activism, of using other people's suffering to boost his own image and relevance. But something else was happening too. Steve's engagement with these issues was attracting the attention of policymakers, of politicians, of people with actual power to create change. He was invited to testify before Congress about economic inequality. He was consulted by think tanks and policy organizations. His voice, amplified by his platform, was becoming part of the national conversation about how to address the systemic issues that had affected Marcus and millions of others like him. Marcus, meanwhile, was navigating his own unexpected journey. The money from Steve had given him some breathing room, but he wanted to do more than just survive on it. He wanted to use his newfound visibility to advocate for change. He started giving speeches at community centers and churches, talking about his experience, about the ways that systemic inequality had shaped his life. He connected with labor organizers and community activists, people who had been fighting these battles for years, often without recognition or resources. He began to understand that his story, while personal and specific to his circumstances, was also part of a much larger pattern. Millions of Americans had experienced similar disruptions, similar struggles. The difference was that most of them didn't have a platform to speak about it, didn't have their moment of visibility on national television. Marcus felt a responsibility to use his platform, limited as it was, to amplify the voices of those who didn't have one. He connected with a nonprofit organization that worked on economic justice issues, and he began volunteering with them, helping to organize community meetings and advocacy campaigns. He used some of the money Steve had given him to support their work, to help fund their programs. It wasn't a lot in the grand scheme of things, but it was something, a way of translating his personal good fortune into support for collective action. But not everyone was happy about Marcus's activism. Some of the people who had initially celebrated his moment on Steve's show began to criticize him for being ungrateful, for not simply accepting his good fortune and moving on. They suggested that he should be satisfied with what he had received, that demanding systemic change was greedy, that it showed a lack of appreciation for Steve's generosity. Others criticized him for being co-opted, for working with nonprofits and policy organizations that they saw as part of the establishment, as not radical enough in their demands for change. They argued that individual charity and policy reforms weren't sufficient, that what was needed was a fundamental transformation of the economic system itself, and that by working within the existing system, Marcus was inadvertently reinforcing it. Marcus found himself caught between competing visions of what his role should be, what his responsibility was. He had to navigate the criticism while also staying true to his own sense of what was right, what was necessary. He decided that he would do what he could, where he was, with what he had. He would work with the organizations and people who were trying to create change, even if that change was incremental, even if it didn't address every aspect of systemic inequality. 6 months after the second episode aired, Steve and Marcus were invited to speak together at a major economic conference. The conference brought together economists, policymakers, business leaders, and activists to discuss the future of work and economic policy in America. Steve and Marcus were asked to participate in a panel discussion about the role of individual responsibility versus systemic factors in economic outcomes. The moderator opened by asking them to reflect on their journey together, on how their initial moment on the game show had evolved into something larger and more complex. Steve spoke first, his words carefully chosen but also authentic and vulnerable. When Marcus came on my show and expressed his frustration, I had a choice, he said. I could have dismissed him, could have defended the system, could have suggested that his problems were the result of personal failings. But something in what he said resonated with me, made me realize that I had been operating with an incomplete understanding of how the world actually works. He paused, looking out at the audience of economists and policymakers. I had built my success on the narrative of hard work and perseverance, on the idea that if you work hard enough, you can achieve anything. And that narrative is true, but it is incomplete. It doesn't account for the ways that the playing field is tilted, the ways that some people have to work exponentially harder than others to achieve the same outcomes. It doesn't account for the structural barriers that make success so much harder for some than for others. He continued, his voice growing stronger as he spoke. Since that moment with Marcus, I've been educating myself about economic policy, about the ways that wage stagnation, the decline of unions, corporate consolidation, and the financialization of the economy have created a situation where hard work alone is often not enough. And I've come to believe that we need policy changes, that we need to fundamentally rethink how we structure our economy to ensure that people who work hard can actually achieve economic security and dignity. Marcus spoke next, his voice carrying the weight of lived experience combined with the understanding he had gained through his activism and education. What Steve is talking about is real, Marcus said. I've worked hard my entire life. I've done everything I was told to do. I got a job. I worked my way up. I tried to provide for my family. And still, I found myself struggling, found myself invisible, found myself wondering if my hard work actually mattered. The problem isn't that I didn't work hard enough. The problem is that the system is designed in a way that makes it increasingly difficult for people like me to achieve economic security, no matter how hard we work. He paused, his gaze sweeping across the room. But I also want to be clear about something. Steve's gesture toward me was meaningful, and I'm grateful for it. But it also highlighted the limits of individual charity. One person giving another person money doesn't solve the problem. What we need is systemic change. We need policies that ensure that everyone who works has access to healthcare, that wages keep pace with productivity, that education is affordable and accessible, that people have the security to take risks and pursue their dreams. The room was silent as both men finished speaking. The moderator turned to the panel of economists and policymakers and asked them to respond to what Steve and Marcus had said. What happened next was significant. Rather than dismissing or minimizing what Steve and Marcus had articulated, the economists and policymakers engaged seriously with their arguments. There was discussion about wage policy, about the decline of union membership, about the ways that corporate consolidation had reduced worker bargaining power, about the need for policy interventions to address inequality. Some defended the current system, arguing that market forces were ultimately self-correcting, that policy interventions could have unintended consequences, that individual responsibility was still the primary driver of economic outcomes. But others acknowledged that the data supported what Marcus and Steve were saying. that wage stagnation was real, that inequality had increased dramatically over the past few decades, that policy changes were necessary. The conversation that had begun on a game show stage had evolved into a serious engagement with economic policy, and while it didn't resolve the fundamental disagreements about how to address these issues, it had elevated the conversation, had made it impossible to ignore the human reality behind the statistics, the way that abstract economic forces had concrete consequences for real people's lives in the months following the economic conference. Steve and Marcus' story catalyzed a broader movement for economic justice. The hashtag #SeeMe became a rallying cry for millions of invisible workers across America. People shared stories of job loss, medical bankruptcy, and housing insecurity. News organizations picked up the trend, publishing investigative pieces and documentaries about inequality. The movement translated into political action. Candidates incorporated economic justice themes into their campaigns. What had been obscure policy discussions suddenly became mainstream political issues. Marcus became a sought-after speaker, traveling across the country, telling his story at universities, labor conventions, and community organizations. He testified before Congress, describing how policy decisions had affected his life and the lives of millions like him. His words reached millions through broadcast and social media. Steve used his platform creatively, producing documentaries about economic inequality and continuing conversations on his talk show with economists and policymakers. He became an unlikely advocate for systemic change, a celebrity willing to push for policy reforms. Not everyone approved. Some fans felt betrayed that he had abandoned entertainment for activism. Conservative commentators criticized his advocacy for what they saw as socialist ideas. But Steve also attracted new admirers who appreciated his moral leadership on inequality. A year after their initial moment, Steve and Marcus collaborated on a book titled "SeeMe: One Man's Journey from Invisibility to Advocacy." It became a bestseller, required reading in college courses on economics and sociology. The book humanized economic inequality and gave voice to struggling Americans. 2 years after Family Feud, significant legislation passed Congress influenced by their advocacy work. The legislation included provisions for raising the minimum wage, strengthening labor protections, making health care more affordable, and increasing funding for education and job training. Steve and Marcus attended the signing ceremony, but both understood this wasn't an ending, merely a milestone in a longer journey. More work remained to be done. When I walked onto that stage, I didn't expect anything to change, Marcus reflected. I was just angry and frustrated. But the issues I raised weren't unique to me. Millions have struggled with these same problems. This legislation is for them. We need to keep pushing for systemic changes that give everyone the opportunity to live with dignity. Steve added, "Meeting Marcus changed me. I realized I had been complicit in systems of inequality through my silence. Once I understood that, I had to use my platform for something more meaningful, to advocate for real change." Both men knew the real test was just beginning, that implementation and enforcement would be long and difficult, and that maintaining momentum for change would require sustained effort from millions of people.